Hi everybody, I'm Henry Badgery and welcome to our third episode of Open Source for Business, brought to you by Open Teams, the open source services marketplace where users of open source software can find, vet, and contract with service providers. In this episode, we talk with Guy Martin, a globally recognized open source strategy expert. Some of the topics which we'll discuss in this episode include the evolution of community management, factors to consider when choosing which open source projects your company should use, what is an open source program office and why are they so important to enterprises, and last but not least, how are open standards and open source two sides of the same coin? So you ready? Let's dive right in.
Hi, I'm Eunice Chenju, and I'm the VP of Partners at Open Teams. Henry and I are very excited to welcome our guest for this episode, Guy Martin, the Executive Director at OASIS. OASIS is a global nonprofit consortium that works on the development, convergence, and adoption of open standards for security, Internet of Things, energy, and many other areas.
Guy is very well known in the open source community and space, and he spent a lot of time actually building out a strategic open source consulting offerings at Red Hat. He also contributed to launching an open source group at Samsung, and he recently left Autodesk where he was directing their open source strategy efforts. Guy is active on social media and can be found on LinkedIn and Twitter at Guy Ma. And I'd also recommend checking out some of the great work, very, very impressive work that OASIS has been doing to help the fight against COVID-19. So you can check that collection of work out at oasis-open.org/COVID. Now that the introductions are out of the way, let's dive right in. Guy, thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Henry and Eunice. I'm really, really excited to be here and great to talk about all the work that OASIS is doing and how we're dealing with open source and standards.
Fantastic. Well, you've published a lot of articles, and that's what I found when I was doing my research. And your name has popped up quite a bit in the last few months that I've been working at Open Teams. You've given presentations around the world, and you're definitely a thought leader in the open source space. I think you've been involved for around or close to 15 years, which is incredible. But when talking with you before this podcast, you mentioned that you actually fell into this career by accident. So on that note, I'd actually like you to I'll ask you to sort of take us back to where you started and give us an idea of actually how you got here today.
Sure. Yeah, I basically started as an engineer. Still consider myself an engineer. Now I don't write code for a living. I write code to annoy the housemates when the IoT stuff doesn't work. But so I'm still an engineer. And I got a computer science degree, and I really started out writing software for a variety of things, everything from embedded to enterprise Java beans, and kind of everything in between. And what I realized sort of early on in my career was that I was an adequate engineer, right? I was a reasonably good engineer, but I was never going to be the world's next great engineer, which was kind of the passion that I had when I got into computer science. But what was interesting is that I could actually talk and communicate with non-technical audiences and explain to them what was going on in technology. And so I ended up being the person who got assigned from the engineering team to work with quality assurance or customers. And for about the first half of my career, I think I kind of fought that. I kind of was like, well, no, I'm still an engineer and I don't want to do this community management or these other things. And about halfway through my career, kind of the light bulb clicked on and I said, wait a minute. I actually am more of a community manager, business strategist person with a technology background. And once that switch went on, it just made life a whole lot easier in reality because it opened up opportunities for me to work in open source consulting, to work in community management, and to work in leadership, which is what I'm doing today.
Fantastic. And so I know that community management, what did it look like back then? Is it the same? Was it the exact same as it looked like today?
Well, I think we didn't really call it community management. I mean, I look back on my career and some of my first roles, again, being the engineer assigned from the engineering team to quality assurance, testing, customer, integration tests. We had built a community. We were building communities of these groups that were very disparate, and we just weren't calling it that. And then, for example, when I was at Sun Microsystems and building out the Java car project, which was a GM EV1 that we basically outfitted with a ton of electronics. And by the way, this was before the telematics age. So we were doing some really crazy things like getting this GM EV1, putting a bunch of hardware in it, ripping up the carpet, running Ethernet cables, right? Having a bunch of wireless stuff in the back. But we were a small skunkworks team in Sun Labs that was doing this. There were three of us. And to actually get this car to a point where we could use it for demos and we could, do experiments on networking, we had to rely on a community of other software engineers at Sun at the time, in JavaSoft division and across the organization. And so looking back on it, we did that. We built essentially a community, what could be called an inner source community now, right? So it was open source stuff, but within the firewall of Sun. And we had somewhere on the order of 15 to 17 people who contributed code to that project by the time that was done. So I think what's interesting is that I didn't think about that as community management as a practice back then, but it just ended up being something that I found I was naturally good at. So that was kind of the nice thing about that, is it got me to a point where I'm at a better point in my career in terms of doing things that I love and still getting to do technology.
Awesome. That's amazing. And it's interesting to see just how it has changed over the years, because it really is mainstream now. It seems like a lot of most big companies either have an open source program office or at least an open source group of some sort. So I was wondering if you could take us back and tell us what did that transition look like from almost where it was growing organically and wasn't as mainstream as it is today to the extent where now we've got companies contributing to open source everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can go back to when I was at Motorola and we had built a sort of an open source office, but we didn't call it that. It was mainly an open source office that was there to quote unquote protect Motorola in terms of licensing and making sure that we did all the right things in terms of the licensing perspective in open source. And so I think, in my opinion, those early open source offices were more about making sure that companies felt like, okay, we're dotting the I's and crossing the T's when it comes to licensing and kind of all those other very tactical areas of open source. But they weren't designed, I think, at that point to be the kind of outward facing open source offices that we have today, right? Where those offices are responsible for compliance and license issues, but they're also responsible for working with the upstream open source communities. They're responsible for helping train internal developers at the company to understand how to work effectively with upstream open source communities. So I think the role of an OSPO, and by the way, there are tons of different OSPOs, and every company sort of has a slightly different take on it depending on what they need. But I think you're seeing more open source program offices in the modern era that are responsible for kind of the outbound marketing and the outbound engagement with open source communities, as well as training people inside the company to be more effective at how they contribute or collaborate with open source communities.
Okay. It seems to be like where we're riding that trend now of either having an OSPO or we're contributing, like I was saying before. My understanding is it wasn't always like that. I'd like to know from you and get your perspective of what you saw. What are the different schools of thought that at least used to be the case for companies wanting to contribute to open source? And can you explain how those perspectives have sort of evolved to where we are today, where a lot of companies at least are contributing to open source?
Yeah, when I actually put together the consulting offering at Red Hat around strategic open source consulting, we kind of came up with this graphic, which, if you can imagine, the Google Chrome logo had strategy and governance at the core, right? Making sure you understand that, and then had rockers around consume, collaborate, and create. And we did that because that's kind of the main areas that you think about in open source. You have to get the strategy and governance, right? The why and how, right? Do you understand why you're participating in open source or using it? Most companies will start with the consume, right? That's kind of the area that a lot of companies really, and again, that goes back to the needing to protect intellectual property and do the licensing and the compliance piece as well. And then I think a lot of companies, I don't want to say fought, but they kind of were like, early on, ooh, wait, we're contributing IP back to this other entity they're not us. And there was a lot of I think, evolution there of organizations going, wait, why am I contributing IP back to this other thing? And then once they started to understand that, hey, I'm contributing this IP back, but other people, including my competitors, are contributing IP to this project, and it's non-differentiated intellectual property, right? It's the things that we all have to use, right? We don't need to all rebuild the highway, right? If we're all running on the highway, we don't all need to do our own specific version of asphalt, right? We need to do things in a way that allows us all to benefit from those things. And I think that's kind of where organizations have, I think, made the most growth. And open source program offices are a big part of that, is getting people to understand, especially business leaders, to understand that you are giving away, quote unquote, giving away intellectual property, but you're doing it in service of your other goals. You're doing it in service of, being able to take your engineering resources and have most of them work on that 20% differentiated intellectual property that's built on top of the 80% of open source that most best-in-class organizations use today.
Wow, that's awesome. And I think now that you've provided context, I'd like to shift focus just a little bit. What are some of the most important factors a company should consider when choosing to use an open source project?
I think one of the big ones for me, and probably from a community standpoint, is what's the community health? And I've been involved in decisions about what open source gets used in an organization. And sometimes it can be, and I say this as an engineer, sometimes it can be a little engineering focused as to, it has this open source project has XYZ feature that we need. Okay. But if the community health isn't great, right? If it's something that's an abandoned project that was out there and then hasn't gotten a lot of traction in quite a while, you as an organization, even though it may have the features you want, if you bring that into your organization, you are then probably going to be responsible for maintaining that going forward. And the benefit of a healthy community, open source community, is that you're not the only one, your organization is not the only one maintaining that. So I think community health is a huge part of that for me, making sure that obviously it's got technical fitness for what you need, but that the community is healthy and that you're not picking up essentially a dead project and trying to manage that all yourself. Now, some cases that might work, right? Where you maybe an organization sort of reboots an open source community project that hasn't had a lot of traction. But it's one of the things when I did consulting that I really stressed to business leaders is kind of have a process where your engineering organization weighs in on the engineering fitness of an open source project, but that you also look at the community health of that project.
How do you actually measure community health?
Well, there's a lot of different ways, right? And I think one of the nice things, I'll give a small plug here for the Chaos Project. If you haven't heard of that, the Chaos Project is about metrics, and it's actually run by a lot of folks that are friends and colleagues of mine. And they're basically trying to answer that exact question, right? Because you can measure it very, very tactically around, okay, how many code contributions have come in? But I think it's also important to look at, what does the support community look like, right? Is there an active, vibrant set of forums where people are talking about this project? When was last released, right? There's kind of different ways, quantitative and qualitative ways you can look at measuring community health. And I think the Chaos Project is doing a great job of trying to crystallize those into something that we can all use in the industry.
Yeah, that's very true. I think one of the biggest thing that I've heard from a lot of companies is really trying to answer that exact question in terms of, how do we know if an open source project is actually healthy, and who is contributing to those open source projects? If I decide to use this, who are going to be the maintainers? I think it's a big question that I'm not sure we have figured out the right answer yet, but there are definitely a few resources out there to help us with that. So I know you've spoken online a lot about the importance of tracking metrics when it comes to open source. So what metrics should businesses focus on when considering the return on investment of using open source software?
Ooh, boy, that's an interesting one, because I think it depends on, there are certain things like community health, right, that are one of those, but it also kind of depends on your individual situation as an organization. Are you a large organization that is willing to take on these projects that maybe are smaller and don't have as many code contributions, or maybe your need is different? Is the project stable, right? Is it something that you're not going to see a lot of upgrades? It can still be a healthy project, right? But it may not have a lot of code contributions, for example. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if I had an exact answer for that specifically, because it kind of depends on the situation, right? You may see a project that has a ton of incoming contributions, and maybe it still doesn't have technical fitness for your organization. So, but understanding sort of what metrics are important to you, and some of what are the common ones, right? Again, number of code contributions, number of bug reports that are coming in, how fast those bug reports are being handled, how fast incoming pull requests to that project are being dealt with, because you can have a project with a lot of contributions or a lot of pull requests to it, and those pull requests are not being managed in a way. I mean, they're taking 6 months to put in a pull request. That's, as an organization, you have to look at that and go, wow, is that the kind of project that is going to be useful for me, especially as my organization starts contributing more to it.
That's the dilemma that a lot of people have is just almost, they just, once you start leaving the issues too long, they just pile and pile and pile and pile and pile. And yeah, I think at least a lot of project maintainers have sort of whined to me about that being a problem.
Right.
So you've had experience building an open source group at Samsung, and you led open source strategy at Autodesk. For those listening, what is an open source program office, and why would any company want to run one?
Well, it's actually funny that you're mentioning this, because I'm in the middle of helping build out or refresh some training for the Linux Foundation around that very topic. One of those topics is an open source program office. Why do you want one? And I just actually finished writing that module the other day, so fresh in my mind. I think it's the central place where your organizations, it's kind of the central nexus around everything you do in open source. Now, the software development may be done in other parts of the organization, but having a central place that helps be responsible for training, helps be responsible for making sure that the liaison with legal is happening, and that all of the compliance issues are being taken care of. And then also, again, the place, I think, where the central nexus of training happens, in terms of making sure that your organization gets the most out of engaging with open source. Because I think, there's been a lot of talk over the years around, free as in freedom, or free as in beer with regard to open source. And open source is not free, right? There's no free lunch here. So as an organization, you get a lot of value from the innovative power of open source and the fact that you've got multiple people that are contributing to this from all over the world, right? I mean, all you have to do is look at the Linux kernel, right? It's the basis for pretty much everything from my watch to a bunch of stuff that we're all relying on. But, it really requires an organization to have a central place. And it doesn't have to be a huge staff type of place, but a central place where clearinghouse, where all these things can be dealt with, and, can be a place where the company is represented out to the external community. Because you're getting some representation from software development teams that are working with open source, but at a corporate level, having the ability to have a place that can do things like make sure events get sponsored, or make sure that that the right things are happening, and the right open source projects that you care about are keeping healthy. I think that those are all areas where an open source program office can really help. And so I think there is a threshold, right? If you're a 2-person company, having an open source program office probably is not the right the right approach. But once you get to a certain level in terms of both people, projects that you're working on, revenue, all those things, then it makes sense to think about what an open source program office can look like. And one of the things I talked about in the training module that I'm building is that your open source program office should follow kind of the mantra that the rest of the open source world does around release early, release often, right? You don't need to build a 500-person open source program office to begin with. You can start with 1 or 2 people. I mean, when we were at Samsung and I helped start that open source program office, we started with 4 people, and we grew it to about close to 20 by the time we were done. But we actually just continued to iterate. So I think you don't have to build out the whole thing from the beginning, but starting small and understanding what are the most important things that organization needs to worry about in open source is a great way to get started.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. And I think from my perspective and from what I've heard a lot is that case, opening an open source program office definitely started when a company starts to pick up in the open source contribution. But for some of the companies that are only users of open source, how will you convince them? And I don't even know if this is still a thing, because in my mind, I'm just like, if you use it, you have to contribute. But I do know that I see some organizations out there that only use open source but don't contribute back. Why will you encourage any company to contribute back to the open source projects they use? And what advice do you have for them when they're getting started?
So I'll answer that by telling you a little story, and I won't mention the company, but it was one of the companies that I've been at in the past that thought we're only going to use open source, right? We don't need to contribute back, or we don't want to give away IP. And it was a very illustrative story because the engineering team came to me for this open source project, and I won't mention the project because that'll also give away which company it was. But they came to me and said, "Hey, we have these upstream we have these changes, these bug fixes we've made for this project, and we're going to go ahead and contribute them back." And I said, "Oh, great, that's awesome. Have you been looking at the mailing lists? Have you been figuring out if the rest of the community have you been participating, figuring if the rest of the community is even, wants these changes, maybe they've already fixed it." They're like, "Oh, no, we're just going to give these changes back because, well, we don't want to deal with it anymore." And I said, "Okay, good luck." And they came back to me about a week later and said, "Oh, yeah, the community already fixed that in a release that was 4 releases ago," right? Because this company, again, was like, "We're going to take this version of open source. We're not going to contribute back. We're only going to use it." And they hadn't updated the internal version of this open source project that was being used to build a product. They hadn't updated it in 4 major revisions. And then they're like, "Oh, we're going to contribute these changes back for these bug fixes." Well, now you're in a really, really weird spot, right? Because you've put engineering resources into fixing these bugs. And so you kind of want some return on investment there. But you're also 4 major revisions behind. And to be able to pull the most recent version in because there's a security fix or something else, you're now in this chicken and egg situation where you're kind of going to expend extra engineering resources either way. And so what I use that story because it's very illustrative about organizations that think they're only ever going to use open source. It's just, I've never seen that actually happen in practice, right? Eventually you're going to find a bug that maybe is an edge case and doesn't show up except how you use that code, open source code in a product, and you've got to fix it, or the open source community doesn't have the time and energy to fix it. And well, if you want to fork that version of an open source project, only use it, never contribute back, never engage with the open source community, you're actually building a bigger support burden for yourself to actually have to worry about that. Rather than if you paid the cost of, contributing back, keeping up with that community, that cost is actually lower in the long run than the strategy of, I'm just going to keep this thing internally and do my own thing with it, and I don't have to contribute back, and I'm just going to grab this code and freeze it in time. Because we all know, right? Code never gets frozen in time. There's always changes, and having a strategy where we're only ever going to use open source, but we're never going to contribute back, I just haven't seen it work in practice because technology changes and bugs are found and features are needed.
Okay, that's fascinating. And we all know how much work the forking takes. Companies, I think, convince themselves that, yes, this is going to help us. We won't have to work with the open source community. We'll just get it changed. But you just end up spending so much money over time. And I was with a few people once, and someone said this very funny thing. They said, companies just have to stop forking themselves. I thought,
I wish I'd thought about that back then. That would have been a great line to use.
But contributing to open source is one side of the spectrum. And then another thing that a lot of companies have been doing, and it's definitely a growing trend, is open sourcing a lot of their code. So when should a company open source their code, and what does that process look like?
Well, I can start with saying when they shouldn't open source their code is if they're trying to get rid of something that's legacy and they think, we're going to put it out there and get, a bunch of great PR around it. Try not to open source stuff that you're end of lifing. I mean, sometimes there's a case for that, right? If it's a file format, I was at an organization where there was a very popular file format. They weren't going to maintain it anymore, and the community had to demand to maintain it, and then they open sourced it. But they went into it with eyes open, as opposed to just saying, we don't need this code anymore, we're going to throw it over the wall. In terms of when you should, I think there are a couple of things to think about. One is, is the code that you have going to be something that you want to promote as a standard, a de facto standard that everyone in the industry uses, including your competitors? Mm-hmm. If that's the case, then that's an opportunity to open source it and kind of, again, share that cost burden with everybody in the industry. It can be used, you can open source code to use that as a disruptor in terms of, changing the industry, making the industry move in a particular direction that's beneficial for your organization. But you have to temper that with understanding that when you open source something like that, you probably have 6 to 8 months where you're the your organization that originally wrote the code has first mover advantage, but then everybody is eventually going to catch up. So I think it's important to understand that the things you open source, obviously you're not going to open source core intellectual property that is your differentiated value, right? But you may open source things that are around that, code that supports something that, is your differentiated value, but that you want everyone in the industry to use. So I think, there's just some things you think about when you open source internal code. And then another area of that to think about is sort of what is the health or the cleanliness of that code, right? So I've helped organizations do this where we go through code review and we're like, oh yeah, we want to open source the code, but we don't want that comment in there, or we don't, or that exposes something that, ties back to something that we're not going to open source. So there's some health things that you need to do, some sanity and sanitation things you need to do before you open source that code. But making the decision to do it, I think, is largely around what's the value for you as an organization.
Okay, and I really like how you touched on sort of starting what you shouldn't do. And I think there's just so many lessons that I think have been learned recently and over the decades as open source has grown. But for the benefits of those listening, and since you do have such a vast array of experience in the open source industry, I wanted to ask, what were some of the biggest mistakes that you've witnessed companies make when either using or when managing open source?
Oh boy. Trying to pick ones.
What a heavy loaded question.
Well, no, trying to pick ones that I can talk about without examining or without giving which company it was. I used the one example already of engineers and then an organization that said, hey, we're only going to consume this thing, and then all of a sudden we have changes, we're going to contribute those back, and the bugs being fixed. So that's one mistake I saw. One I kind of alluded to and touched on of the falling prey to the metrics, and I love metrics as an engineer, but falling prey to the metrics of, we're going to create 10 new open source projects this year, right? That's our metric. We want to create 10 new open source projects. Not we want to create 5 great open source projects, but we're going for quantity, not quality. That's a big one. I've seen that happen a couple of times, and what ends up happening is the organization basically gets a bad reputation in the open source world of, hey, they're just throwing stuff over the wall to throw stuff over the wall. Mm-hmm. Let's see, what's another one? I think not strategically thinking about what open source you're going to consume. Mm-hmm. This is actually one I've seen quite a bit, where organizations will just kind of it grows organically, right? Where a lot of engineers will just cut and paste or bring things in, and there's not, a good compliance process. And by that, I mean, when I say good, I mean not one that is so restrictive that engineers don't want to go use open source, and not one that is so loose that it's like the Wild West inside your organization, but somewhere in the middle that you both strategically think about what open source makes sense for you to bring in, but you have the processes in place to make sure that you are not violating licenses. You're not combining a piece of open source with one license with an incompatible another piece of open source, and then making sure that if you don't do that, you're not going to have the issue of sort of the viral nature of GPL. So there was a specific instance where code was brought in and it actually went through the checking process, but the threshold, we were using a tool at the time, and I won't say which tool, that checked to see in an incoming piece of code that we got from a supplier that whether it had open source or not. Well, it turns out the code did have open source, but it was at a threshold below what the reporting threshold was of the tool. Mm-hmm. And the issue was that if it were any other license other than GPL, it wouldn't be a big deal, but it was GPL. And as we know, for those that don't know, the GPL has a viral property where if you combine it with a piece of proprietary code, you can, in some cases, be responsible for then making sure that the proprietary code is available, right? Which obviously is an issue for an organization that's using that code to provide differentiated value. So that was an interesting time as we navigated that one.
Okay, that's definitely a great mistake to learn from. Is that so? In terms of understanding who consumes, and I guess making those decisions, does that start at the OSPO, since that's the heart of almost open source excellence, or is it start with the engineering team who is trained by the OSPO? What does that look like?
I think it has to start with the engineering team, because even in the most the largest OSPOs, OSPOs that I've seen. There's just too much going on in a big organization where to make that the bottleneck. I think they need to help in the training. They need to be part of helping create those processes, but they need to be, it's kind of strange. And OSPO almost sits between two worlds, that you need to be an advocate for the company and for the engineering teams. And you kind of need to be an advocate for the open source world, right? So there's an interesting sort of juxtaposition you have as somebody who's in an OSPO. But yeah, I think it has to start with the engineering teams. Those engineering teams need to feel like they have the tools and processes in place to be able to consume that open source and know that they're consuming it in a way that's going to be consistent with company policy.
Okay, great. And then I'd like to shift gears a little bit and focus on your current role at OASIS. So I know that you, what actually prompted you to leave Autodesk, where you're working on building out the OSPO there, Open Source Program Office for those listening, to then move to OASIS, where you're now working on open source and standards?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very interesting opportunity. I think one of the things, if you go back and look sort of at my history, is I worked on a project called Forge.mil for U.S. Department of Defense. And it was the first opportunity, really one of the first opportunities in government to really work on sort of community building, inner source, open source types of things. And what was interesting is it was ahead of its time in a lot of ways. And we didn't get some of the uptake. We had some good successes, but we didn't get some of the uptake that we wanted. And a lot of the reason we didn't get the uptake had nothing to do with technology or really even culture, because there were a lot of people in government that really wanted this to work. It was all about the procurement process, right? And the procurement processes that were put in place in highly regulated environments like government or finance or medical are built around standards, right? And so getting open source into that environment was a bit challenging, right? And it's improved since then. And you've got organizations like Red Hat, for example, that have been doing great work within governments. But I think there's still this legacy in some of these procurement processes that they're based upon open standards. And I would love to see, as an open source person, more open source innovation being used in these highly regulated industries. And so when the OASIS opportunity came up, I looked at this and said, wow, this is a great place to be, that we want to marry the amazing reputation that OASIS has as a standards definition organization, and great relationships they have in government, great relationships they have with other standards definition orgs like ISO, ITU, W3C, all of those, and marry that with open source in a way that actually allows that to be the best of both worlds. Because I also think about, and I wrote about this in an opensource.com article recently, if you actually go back to the history of the beginnings of the internet and the beginnings of all the things we rely on now, they're based on their standards, right? HTTP, for example, and there's an open source implementation of that, right? So this has always sort of been this way. And then I think maybe recently in the most recent past, you've sort of had, for whatever reason, the differentiation of, oh, this is open source and this is open standards, and the two of them aren't compatible. And that actually absolutely is not the case. And so I think the opportunity at OASIS was something that I think of as a way to demystify open source in these highly regulated industries that rely on standards as their main procurement mechanism.
That's very interesting. And for those of us listening today, what exactly does OASIS do?
So OASIS, as you mentioned at the beginning, we're a standards definition organization. So an organization that helps the industry define standards. But we're also an organization that helps host open source and helps do open source projects with the opportunity for those open source projects to have a path towards standardization. And that's the really key element, right? I think a lot of people in my open source community, again, looked at me when I decided to go to OASIS and said, wait, that seems like a very divergent career move for you to go to standards. And I actually don't think it is. I think that I've had some experience in the past with the Open Connectivity Foundation, for example, where we had which is a project around putting an abstraction layer on top of Internet of Things devices to hide the networking layer, so that application developers can write to one interface and not have to worry about Zigbee, Z-Wave, all these different other wireless protocols. And that organization started out as a standards definition body that then had an open source reference implementation of that standard. And in seeing that and doing that work with the OCF, I saw that there's a great opportunity for those two communities to work together, right? The open standards folks and the open source folks, because a lot of what happened in OCF, for example, was that the open source reference implementation feature would come in that hadn't been considered in the standard, but then the standards folks were like, oh yeah, we missed that. We need to go back and deal with that. And vice versa. There would be things that would come in the standard that the open source project would say, oh yeah, we have to account for that.
Yeah.
And the beauty of having the standard is that you are then able to not only get it into these highly regulated industries, but you also have the opportunity to define interoperability in a way that allows multiple different implementations. And I think that's the one area where maybe in open source, we look at interoperability at the API layer as opposed to the whole implementation layer, right? In other words, can you do an implementation in a different language, different platform, and is there going to be interoperability? So, I think OASIS is an organization that has traditionally been only really on the standard side. And in the last couple of years, even before I joined, they've been making a move towards bringing open source in and helping open source projects figure out a way to get to standardization, right? So kind of, it's in essence, it's like a community building exercise, right? I think OASIS is a great place for the two communities, the open source and the standards community, to come together.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I think you did mention this a little bit, but I'm just curious, in a more structural way, why would any business care about open standards?
Yeah, I mean, businesses do care about open standards, and I think it's interesting that, and it kind of depends on the business that you're in, right? I think a lot of, again, more highly regulated types of industries like medical, for example, care heavily about standards, right? Especially as it relates to things like medical equipment, right? We all want our medical equipment to conform to standards so that you actually have some interoperability. If you've got a pacemaker made by one company and some sort of other monitoring tool made by a different company, they should be able to exchange data, right, in service of the ultimate end user, which is the patient. So I think having standards continue to be a core value in our society and with organizations like OASIS is really, really important.
So you briefly touched on it before, but for the industries and regulatory bodies that OASIS has relationships with, what's their perspective of open source?
I think everyone has seen that the running joke is open source is one, and it has to a degree, right? I mean, maybe not on the desktop, right? Everyone jokes about when is Linux going to be the desktop environment, but I think everywhere else, the industry has sort of figured out that open source is one. But these areas that traditionally rely on standards, I think it's in some ways the perception is that open source is still a little bit of the Wild West. And I don't really think that's the case. I think, some of the best open source projects out there are run really, really effectively. Yeah. And being able to say, okay, hey, this open source project conforms to this standard. So if you don't want to use that open source code, great, you can go off and write your own and there's going to be interoperability. I think that these organizations that have traditionally only dealt with standards will feel more comfortable with open source as the marriage between open source and standards becomes a little bit more of a reality.
Okay, so it seems that OASIS is almost uniquely positioned, and you use the word to demystify, which I really liked before, open source to these open standard or people you deal with within open standards. So what does that look like really? What does that look like since you've been there and after talking to people who have been there for a while? And what impact do you think OASIS is going to have in that regard?
So on my vast experience of 4 months as the OASIS executive director, I think what it looks like is that both OASIS, the organization, and the people that we serve recognize that this is important. So little side story on this that can give some color to this. So the number of people in the open source world that sort of do what I do, sort of the open source program office, business strategy, we joke, and it's actually not that big of a joke, that there are about 40 or 50 of us in the world. We all know each other. And so it's not surprising when these opportunities like the OASIS executive director come up that you kind of know other people that are also going for the role. The other two finalists, there were 3 finalists for this role. The other 2 finalists I know, colleagues in the open source world. But I think what was interesting is that as I looked back as executive director as to what the hiring process looked like, all three finalists for the role were open source people. And I think that shows that the organization and the work that has been going on with open projects for almost 2 years, right? The open projects part of OASIS shows that the organization believes, and the constituents of the organization, the members and the people that we serve, believe that open source is extremely important. And I think that the move towards making sure that we bring in open source expertise, that we have an advisory council, for example, at OASIS that is comprised of a lot of those 40 or 50 people that I talked about. And their role is to help OASIS and me make sure that we, again, marry open source and standards in a way that does not get rid of standards, right? I think it's one of the things that I've been really adamant about as I've come on board, both with members and staff and our board of directors, is that my job is not to come in and make OASIS an open source organization purely. My job is to come in and bring enough open source in and marry it with the great value we have in standards, so that when our constituents look at and members look at what OASIS is doing, they're like, okay, we see value there. We see value in the open standards work and how it ties in with open source.
Awesome. Well, Guy, you have over a decade of experience in the open source industry. And one thing that I always like to ask our guests is, if you were to compare open source today to where it was 10 years ago, what are the differences that stands out the most to you?
I think the obvious notion is that it's mainstream, right? I think when I started in open source, there weren't open source program offices, but the prevailing way that people thought about open source, especially I think at the business and strategy level, is, ooh, that's scary. I'm not sure what to do about that, right? All my engineers are telling me I should use this, but I don't know kind of if this is going to make sense or if this is going to expose me to issues.
Yeah.
That is gone, right? I think every business leader I've ever talked to now, in the most recent past, has said, well, yeah, we understand, it's not an option. We have to use open source because we're competing against organizations. If we try to build everything ourselves, we're competing against organizations that are using 80% open source, focusing their engineering value on that 20% value add. Yeah. And we're just not going to be able to compete with that. So I think that's one of the biggest changes I've seen, is the acceptance of open source as just a given, and doing something with it in an intelligent way is really, really important. And I think that's what most organizations see now, is that they have to do something with open source in an intelligent way, and hence the growth of the open source program office.
Exactly. And I think we've all seen that change happen over the last, I would say probably the last 2 decades with the growth of open source. But also, what do you see the future of open source to be like?
I think the future of open source, and it's something that everyone's been talking about, and kind of very much what Open Teams is about, is what is the sustainability model for open source, right? I think open source also, to kind of go back a little bit to your previous question, open source previously I think was seen as, oh, this is hackers and people in flip-flops and hoodies in the garage, right, doing this as their side project. Yeah. So now open source is mainstream in terms of most open source is being developed by corporate developers who are being paid to do it. But sort of understanding where we go from there and making sure that sustainability is a thing, right? That these businesses that are using, and everyone, companies that are using open source, contribute back not only code for that, but also contribute back to make sure that these smaller open source projects are maintained, right? I think nobody's worried about the Linux kernel, right? Linux Foundation, everybody's sort of taking care of that with Linus and that team. But it's some of these smaller open source projects, and I know that there's been work done around the Core Infrastructure Initiative to fund these things like OpenSSL and NTP and some of these smaller projects. But there's a lot of more smaller projects, and again, I think it's where Open Teams is doing some great work, is understanding that there's I think, Henry, before the podcast, you and I talked about the long tail of open source, right? The long tail of these projects that maybe aren't the mainstream quote unquote projects, but they're the core pieces that things like Node.js and other things rely on. We have to, as an industry, really do a better job of making sure that those projects are continue to be sustainable.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's something that a lot of companies need to focus on. And I think they are focusing on it. And definitely perspectives have to change. And I even know when we talked with Gil Yehuda the other day, he actually was part of the dark side early on. He didn't believe in open source. He was against it, just like everyone else. And then he sort of took a step back and said, okay, wait, let's look at this. Let's actually listen to some of the people in open source, some of the thought leaders, and let's see what this really is. And I think it's just so exciting to be part of that journey and part of that wave of growth, because it really has not just, I think, been an evolution for the world, but I think it's evolved software, obviously, but it's also pushed. The open source ethos, I think, has just touched every aspect of our lives these days.
Right.
So we're about to wrap up now, but I wanted to leave the audience with something, and that is, if you were someone at a company, either an executive or just a manager, an employee, or someone who could really make a change, and even if not, maybe they could just be a lower grade employee, but could still make a change. How can they, what steps would you take to actually drive change so that the company you work at actually becomes a bit more open source friendly?
Ooh, I mean, I think education is at the heart of that, right? I mean, understanding, looking at other players in your industry who are doing open source and asking why, right? And talking to them and understanding their journey through open source and why they chose to make that decision. That's been, having built that consulting offering again at Red Hat, I think that's one of the things that we did pretty consistently early on, is we would come into organizations that maybe weren't hostile to open source, but they were maybe a bit ambivalent. They weren't sure what they wanted to do. And we'd bring case studies and we'd say, hey, your XYZ company in your sector is doing open source and here's the benefit they're seeing. Mm-hmm. And I think that is kind of you generally don't have to convince engineers anymore. We're to a point, I think, generationally, where engineers are coming out of school going, oh yeah, open source makes sense. Duh, right? I mean,
I've used it here, I've used it there.
Exactly. But some of our more, how do I put this gently, as a middle-aged white person in tech, some of our more seasoned executives still maybe are, especially if they're in sort of ancillary industries that haven't really been in technology and now are kind of in technology just by the nature of sort of how we are as a society. They sort of have to be convinced around what the business value is. And so being able to bring in these case studies and or point people, if you're somebody in an organization who isn't as open source friendly, and bring data, right? Bring examples of why this is valuable and sort of why we all in the open source world are continuing to push this and it's continuing to grow. So I think, again, every time I've had a conversation with a business leader that was questioning why open source, first of all, I don't have very many of those conversations anymore recently, but and I think, by the way, it's funny that you said Gil was on the dark side, because Gil's now like one of the biggest champions of open source ever, and amazing. But
they've got a king hat for him at the open source program office.
They do have a king hat, and the side note is I brought him a beret back from France. That's from the Linux Foundation. We had berets, so I brought him a beret. Wears my beret periodically. But sorry, getting back to it, I think that just making sure that you, as someone who's in an organization, can point out that there's value in open source, and here's why there's value, and other people in the industry are doing it, and here's the value they're seeing from it.
Okay, that's great. And I think that's an amazing way to end the episode. So thank you so much for all of your insights today, Guy. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you and being able to sort of dig deeper with all of your vast array of experience and knowledge. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Henry and Eunice. Appreciate it. Had a great time.
So to those of you who are listening, if you liked what you listened today, then please like the video and go to our YouTube channel and subscribe if you are on YouTube. But if you're listening to the podcast, then please leave a review and let us know what you think. Our next episode, we'll be talking to Patrick Mason, the General Manager and Board Director at Open Source Initiative. So stay safe, everyone. And until next time, thanks for listening.
Thank you, everyone.